It's been an intense few years in American politics. Donald Trump's presidency has led to a realignment of party values on the right and a split on the left about how to respond. So is this just squabbling, or are the pillars of democracy under threat? That's the subject of a new book by Greg Sargent, author of the Washington Post's Plumline blog. It's called An Uncivil War: Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Trumpian Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. Reena Ninan spoke to Sargent about the road we've been on lately.
In your book, you say that we're living in what's a dangerous period in American politics. Why?
Well, I would call it a fraught period more than a dangerous period, although there are conceivably dangerous scenarios. The reason it's fraught is because, there's a widespread sense, I think, really more than we've seen in decades, that our political system is in serious trouble. And, in some ways it's encouraging that people are really waking up to this fact. What I write about in the book is this. There's a big disconnect at the core of this that I found, which is that it took a character like Trump, who's sort of singularly hostile to democracy, openly contemptuous of it in pretty much every public setting and in every tweet and every public pronouncement. It took that type of persona to rivet everyone's attention on the state of our political system. But the problems predate Trump, long predate Trump, and will long outlast him. What I try to argue in the book is that we need to somehow figure out a way of sustaining this kind of outpouring of pro-democracy sentiment, if you could call it that, and keeping it going after he's gone, presuming that happens, after he's gone and is no longer there to galvanize anymore. It needed Trump to do that. It shouldn't have.
President Obama has said in the past that Trump is a symptom, not a cause of the political unrest and division. But based on your research, is that true?
Yeah, I think you can really see a lot of the stuff that Trump is doing now in previous Republican behavior, really going back years and years, right? His attacks on the media are incredibly explicit, and he casts the media as the enemy of the people, which is not something Republicans would say explicitly for a long time. Right? But for many years, the conservative movement has tried to demonize the press as fundamentally hostile to, real American values.
So you're saying this isn't a Donald Trump thing?
Well, I think he's probably taking it to explicit new extremes, but a lot of that groundwork was already laid. Many Republican voters had been told for many years, for instance, that, voter fraud is a serious problem. And so he came out and made it even more explicit, said, if I lose, the election's fraudulent, right? So he's speaking to audiences that have been primed for many years by Republican politicians already.
You mentioned voter fraud. A lot of your book looks at gerrymandering. You've also looked at voter suppression. What have you learned from your research on exactly what we're seeing in those areas?
Well, one thing I learned, and I think this has been widely established in recent years, is that voter fraud is a myth, right?
Voter fraud is?
A myth, right? It doesn't really exist. And by voter fraud, I mean voter impersonation fraud, which specifically means impersonating someone at the polls. Study after study after study has shown it's made up.
Because the president did look into this.
He created a whole commission,
yes.
and people forget this, but the reason he created the commission was to back up the original lie that he told, right?
At the beginning, when he entered office.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, again, this is something, it's really important to remember that the Republican audiences have been primed for this for many years. And one thing that I noticed in the polling, looking at a lot of it, is that there's an enormous divide between Republicans and Democrats on these questions. Republicans genuinely believe that voter fraud is a real thing. And why
is there such a divide, Greg? Why do Republicans think one way and Democrats so very differently on this issue?
I didn't get into why Republicans have concluded that, but I will tell you one thing. I had an interview with a Republican pollster, a prominent Republican pollster, and this is one of my favorite parts of the book, in which the pollster said, his years of research, and this is a guy who studies Republican primary voters very closely, has polled them for years, has focus grouped them for years. He found that many of these voters actually believe in not just that voter fraud is a real thing, but that there's essentially a sort of shady alliance between minority voters and in some cases illegal immigrant voters and Democrats. And so what Republican voters have come to believe, according to this Republican pollster, is that because they believe that, they think any tactic in response is justified, such as voter suppression. And as he put it, these Republicans think, well, they're cheating us, so we're just trying to straighten it out and rectify it.
When you talk about Democrats, many have questioned Democrats should actually toughen their response. And you write that Democrats, and I'm quoting here, intensely should study what Republicans have done so well with an eye towards closing the hardball gap. What is the hardball gap, and what can Democrats learn from Republicans?
Well, the hardball gap, so constitutional hardball is actually something that political scientists have studied. And what it is, parties manipulating the rules of political competition or manipulating the legislative process in a way that sort of violates what people previously understood as kind of fair play. What I determined was that it's very clear that Republicans have played constitutional hardball to a far, far, far greater extent than Democrats. Now, what the left says is, Democrats, if that's the case, stop whining about it and toughen up and do the same thing.
So what does that mean, run more negative ads?
Well, so I think what the left usually means by that is prepare to pack the court, the Supreme Court, if Democrats take full power and pass things and see things struck down by the court, do what FDR did and try to pack the court, or scrap the filibuster on legislation. What they fundamentally want is for Democrats to recognize what they're up against in today's Republican Party. And what I try to suggest is, yes, you want to close the hardball gap, but at the same time, we can't lose sight of ideals of fair play. We got to try to figure out ways of, making some of these processes a little bit more sane. Otherwise, everything will just continue spiraling into polarization and bitterness and so forth and so on.
You also write that this erosion in politics is likely to continue even if Democrats take back the House. Do you think we'll see the president change his tone at all or his approach?
It's very hard to say with him. He could always grow more combative and more crazy, right? But you can sort of see scenarios in which he might want to deal with Democrats. I mean, on infrastructure or something like that, he's always wanted to unveil a big infrastructure package. And if there's a Democratic majority in the House, the chances of actual, collaboration would improve if Democrats had both houses. As long as there's a Republican Senate, even a Democratic House, it would seem to be pretty tough to reach compromise on some of these big issues. But if somehow Democrats were to take both, I don't think that's going to happen, but if they did, you could kind of see a scenario in which Trump says, you know what, I want to sign an infrastructure bill, right? The Republicans, he could go out there and say, those Republicans are losers. They should have won the election. If they had been more like me, they would have won. And they weren't, So I'm just going to sign a deal with these guys and make America great again. I mean, maybe that's a bit of a fantasy, but you can kind of see it happening.
That was author Greg Sargent speaking with our Reena Ninan.